I'm J.M. Tyree. I write about movies, and I teach in the cinema program at VCU Arts.
You keep saying you got something for me.
In the 60s, Nancy Sinatra's number one hit, These Boots Are Made for Walkin', quickly became a feminist anthem. Turns out, it also became a military anthem. And marching to boots, well, that changes the meaning entirely. I'm Lacey Healy, and this is Things That Go Boom from PRI and Inkstick Media, a podcast about the ins, outs, and what have yous of what keeps us safe. Today, we'll talk about what happens when the military thinks outside the box.
These boots are gonna walk all over you.
You're going to tell me a story today about the Nancy Sinatra song, These Boots Were Made for Walkin'. So what does this have to do with the military at all?
It's sort of a secret history of a classic pop song that appears in two great war movies. A bit about the song first, released in 1966, was the number one hit in the U.S. and the U.K., written by Lee Hazelwood, sung by the great Nancy Sinatra, of course. Classic, sort of hair-raising, goosebump-inducing, sort of slinky opening bass line.
Oh, yeah, and the music video, those boots, the go-go miniskirt, and the big blonde hair. Nancy Sinatra really done up good, and we all can probably recall that opening line. You keep saying you got something for me? Something you call love?
You call love, but confess.
You've been messing where you shouldn't have been messing.
Yeah, and now someone else is getting all your bets.
So in a military context, tell me this.
Well, it's funny because, first of all, it starts out with the song itself becoming a hit, and then Nancy Sinatra actually goes to Vietnam, and she sings in front of the troops in 66 and 67 in this USO show. That
was one of those big, famous USO tours, like Elvis and Nancy Sinatra, right?
Yeah, exactly. And, she became a really strong advocate for Vietnam vets. And it was sort of, the song Boots was sort of adopted strangely in this kind of gender-bending way, I think, by Vietnam soldiers as a kind of marching anthem. And it gets picked up in these two films about Vietnam. The first one's a documentary called The Anderson Platoon that was made in 1966. And then, of course, later in Stanley Kubrick's, very famous 1987 film Full Metal Jacket.
So tell me about the Anderson Platoon. That was the closest, I guess, to the actual release of the song and this USO tour.
It was an Oscar winner. The song appears in the film, but the subject of the film, it follows the fortunes of a platoon of American soldiers, mostly from poorer backgrounds, and they'd been conscripted to fight in Vietnam, and their platoon leader was an African-American West Point officer named Joseph B. Anderson, and that's why the film's called The Anderson Platoon. So one of the scenes, you see the Armed Forces radio DJ.
The time right now, 17 minutes past 2. You're listening to Armed Forces Radio, AM and
starting
FM,
to
right
play
the
very first few seconds of
Sunday
These Boots
afternoon.
Are Made for
Matter of
Walking.
fact, Miss Nancy Sinatra, boots are made for walking.
And then you actually see these guys slogging through the jungle, through the bogs and through the rivers, and their boots are getting really sort of wet and dirty, and you hear the song playing as you see them tromping through the jungle, and it's just an amazingly cool sequence in documentary film.
I just found me a brand new box of matches, yeah.
One of these days, these boots are going to walk all over you. It takes on a whole new context.
That's what's so fascinating about it. I mean, the song refers to the person who's been lying when they should have been truthin', messing where they shouldn't have been messing, and then all of a sudden you're like, hang on a second.
It changes it completely, the entire song. There are some stories, at least, that soldiers picked this up and they were marching, singing this song, right?
I've heard that as well. And there's that interesting gender-bending element to it, puts the soldiers in the position of being the exploited people who are taking revenge. And one of the fascinating things about the song is that it actually gets quite violent, so to speak. In other words, when you first hear the song and you think, okay, so your boots are made for walking, right? So When you find out that your lover's been cheating on you, you'll walk out with these boots that are made for walking. But it's not just that she's walking out. She's going to walk all over this guy.
Yeah.
She's going to stomp on him.
And at the end, it gets a little bit, you keep thinking you'll never get burnt. I just found me a brand new box of matches. There's so many things about this song that really intrigue me, because on one hand, it's very young Nancy Sinatra in these go-go boots and this short skirt. Even as a feminist anthem, it feels a little off. And then you also have this sort of almost appropriation of it by men who then take it and sing it as a military marching song. So it's really kind of an awkward history, ultimately.
I think so. You put it brilliantly. I mean, I don't know if I have much more to add to that.
Or how about its use in Full Metal Jacket?
Oh, my goodness. This is one of the most amazing moments, I think, in cinema history. And the way that the song comes in is utterly remarkable. If you can imagine yourself watching the film, you've just seen Private Pyle murder his drill instructor and then kill himself with his rifle. There's a fade to black, and then the next thing that you hear is that unforgettable bass line.
And the next thing you see is a short skirt.
It's a Vietnamese sex worker who is sort of sauntering, I guess the word would be, towards a couple of American soldiers on the streets of Da Nang.
Hey, baby! You got girlfriend, Vietnam?
So they're hanging out in a cafe, and all of a sudden they're sort of accosted by this Vietnamese prostitute that's sort of selling her wares, and you hear the song throughout their exchange. And so then the song just takes on like a completely different flip, maybe. Who is the exploiter and who's the exploited, right? It seems to be a sense of now the Vietnamese are the people that are sort of being stepped on, and they're going to take revenge. And you see a little hint of that in that scene. It's played for laughs at that moment, but it's a lot less funny towards the end of the film, because what actually ends up happening is, Matthew Modine's platoon, they're really in trouble on the battlefield, and they think they're about to be ambushed by, dozens of North Vietnamese troops. But actually, in the end, it turns out to be a single sniper that's targeting them, and it's actually a woman. She's fighting for her country. She's highly motivated, and she's decided that, she's going to take revenge.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Lacey. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
In our first two episodes, we talked a lot about misinterpretation, how wires get crossed, and how crossing those wires can lead to war. But on the flip side of those ideas is a whole other possibility, which is that maybe a little creativity could save us all. Here's another story.
So I was just craving Thin Mints because Thin Mints are my favorite Girl Scout cookie. And I just was researching online, when do Girl Scouts push this? And then I made the connection of gamified learning through badges, through a tangible badge. So how could I use this existing platform to make a stance in nuclear and to spread that awareness?
Aman Sarak didn't know quite what to think this fall when she read one of her course descriptions at the Rhode Island School of Design, which you might know as RISD. The description said something about approaching complex problems with multiple stakeholders and possible outcomes. And Aman thought maybe that meant global health. Both of Aman's parents are doctors who met in a chemistry lab at Caltech. And she grew up dreaming of things like lab equipment and genetic sequencing. She's always wanted to help people on a global scale. Today, Aman could just as easily be pre-med at Harvard. She's brilliant, beautiful, and poised, the kind of kid you know is just on the brink of running the world. She's also an artist, a painter. So, not so coincidentally, when it came time to apply to college, she applied to both the traditional Harvard types and the artistic Harvard types. And RISD won out. But still, when RISD said complex problems, they caught Aman off guard. Because, for some reason that none of us, myself included, could understand, they were talking about nuclear threats. So, Aman approached the problem with some Girl Scout cookies of her own.
So first I started off by making badges. So 4 nuclear badges that you see on the back of the Girl Scout
And so
box.
the Girl Scout cookie, this is literally a Girl Scout cookie box.
This is, I think, 2/3 of a scale of a regular Girl Scout cookie box.
And on the front is a little girl with goggles on, like she's a scientist. And they're yellow cakes. They're literally little yellow cakes, which I don't know if folks don't realize. Yellow cake is what we mine. It's like the uranium that we mine to make nuclear weapons.
And then I bought some cookies to put inside.
And nuclear badges on the back. So wait, tell me about the nuclear badge.
So there are 4 nuclear badges. One about nuclear policy, history of nuclear, scientific discovery of nuclear, and global nuclear. So trying to give an educative plan to the Girl Scouts without introducing fear-mongering. Because a lot of the jargon around nuclear is very like fear heavy, and I really didn't want to show that. I wanted to show it as a technology that can be used for good and bad, and that it's up to us to make that decision.
Aman's idea, which, just so we're clear, is still just an idea, the Girl Scouts haven't picked it up, is based in something called gamified learning, which sounds really complicated, but is just this really fancy way of saying if you make it fun in a game, humans will like it. The Girl Scouts, Boy Scouts, and so many of our own childhood experiences are based on this. But that's not all. Aman's cookie box is also based on a whole lot of nuclear research and expertise.
People were saying, like, maybe you should put some uranium-235 in them, but I don't want to poison my customers. So, not a good idea. Yeah. I mean, like, radiation is everywhere after all of the atmospheric testing, but let's just leave it at that.
Aman's professor this term was Tom Weiss, who's brilliant in his own right, with the kind of impressive resume you'd expect of a RISD professor. But if you stumbled upon Tom's office this fall, you could easily be fooled into thinking it belonged to a nuclear policy analyst.
I mean, look at all the things I have around me. It's like articles about our weapons stockpile or budgets and treaties.
Yeah, I love it, actually, that in the RISD industrial design professor's office, actually I hadn't even noticed until now, on the bulletin board is analysis, understanding the Iran nuclear deal, U.S. nuclear weapons inventory 2017, all of these, an article for the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, like nuclear costs and constraints. I mean, it's all nuclear stuff.
Yeah.
Everything.
But I think the funny thing is that I spent a lot of time trying to learn a little bit about this stuff, but then at a certain point I realized I'm not a political scientist. This is not what I do. I need to know enough that I can have conversations with people, but I need to focus on what it means to be a designer and what it means to be creative and what it means to be able to influence through the tools that I know how to use rather than trying to understand someone else's. And so that's part of what the students have to learn as well.
Tom's deep-seated thinking, it's based in design. And that means even when we're dealing with big, intractable problems that have been around for decades, centuries even, where progress feels like a totally impossible outcome, Tom teaches his students to shoot for the stars. So the idea is that you would partner with the Girl Scouts to make this happen, right? Mm-hmm. That it would be a special campaign.
Yeah.
Have you reached out to the Girl Scouts at all?
I have. Unfortunately, to sponsor this idea, you have to go to many different Girl Scout areas because they're all over, and you would have to get one to get on board that would launch it, and only in that community. And then if it succeeds, then they go through a whole region, and then they go for the full nation.
Oh, interesting. So there is a legitimate process to do something like this.
And to get a new Girl Scout cookie to release, you have to go in front of the cookie board, which is amazing.
That is amazing.
But
where is the cookie board?
It's from the heads of both the Little Brownie and ABC Bakery, the 2 bakers that can bake Girl Scout cookies, and you have to go in front of them and you propose it, and you have to give them the recipes, everything, and I haven't figured out a recipe for a cookie yet, but almost there.
Most ideas around nuclear weapons were developed during the Cold War, and today, a lot of folks have just written the whole issue off. People who aren't nuclear policy experts or politicians don't even try to think about how to grapple with problems around nuclear weapons. And experts, well, President Obama's suggestion that we might rid the world of nuclear weapons at the beginning of his first term was so radical that he won a Nobel Prize just for saying it.
I'm not naive. This goal will not be reached quickly, perhaps not in my lifetime. It will take patience and persistence. But now we, too, must ignore the voices who tell us that the world cannot change.
In response, some commentators argued that the prize might be the final nail in the coffin of the Nobel Committee itself. Just the suggestion of change can be controversial. So, as a woman in nuclear policy, it's kind of amazing to think of a whole new generation of women thinking about how to shake up the status quo. And maybe coming up with ideas that the rest of us might have never considered.
Girl Scouts are all about troops and how you can leave a legacy. And I thought, well, how about if many girls leave a legacy? It will be better than one person leaving a legacy. So these badges are intertwined so that the whole troop has to get them together so that they can make an impact together rather than just by themselves.
Aman's idea isn't just about nuclear weapons. It's about everything the Girl Scouts stand for. It's about helping young women build a strong sense of self, seek challenges, build positive values in relationships, and solve real problems. And in a lot of ways, it's Aman's background in design that's helped her develop this strong, healthy base of understanding. She wasn't a Girl Scout herself, but her cookies, they're this glimmer of hope in a subject and society that are so cynical. And it opens the door to the question, if our military were thinking this way, would things be different?
I'm Lieutenant Colonel Brian Novoselic. I am the director for West Point's Center for Innovation and Engineering. I'm also an assistant professor in the Department of Civil and Mechanical Engineering.
And I am Lieutenant Colonel Harry Jones. I'm an associate director for design for the Center for Innovation and Engineering and an assistant professor of philosophy here at West Point.
Colonels Brian Novoselic and Harry Jones, who we're just going to go ahead and call Brian and Harry from here on out, have wondered the same thing. And they're no strangers to thinking outside the box. Part of their job at West Point is to think about human-centered design and to work with research agencies like DARPA. Those are the folks who brought you the internet. So it's no surprise that when Harry met Tom, Aman's professor from RISD, through a mutual friend, they connected right away. And it wasn't long before they decided to team up. Here's Cody Chu, another student in Tom's class.
It was a very interesting experience being in an art school and having, I don't want to misrepresent them, but they looked like a team of Jason Bournes walking into class, So it was very intimidating. Scrawny Asian kids. Yeah, Matt Damon's walking in, very handsome gentleman. Yeah, but they were very professional. Nothing like the stereotypes you think of. You think of like army jock. They're the group of the smartest people you've ever met.
You can imagine the scene. A bunch of big, strong military dudes walk into a bar, except the bar is full of scrawny design nerds with cookies. It sounds like a disaster.
Yeah, this is Harry. So that initial meeting was a bit of an experience design itself. There's always discussion, what are we going to wear? How are we going to engage in the first meeting? And we decided that we wanted a fairly dramatic entrance on all sides. So everyone stayed in uniform and we were in our dress uniforms. And so, yeah, that wasn't completely accidental.
Setting the stereotypes aside, what we're really talking about is a room full of college students. It didn't take long for them to connect. That doesn't mean they were immediately on the same page. Even Brian was surprised to find out how much their interpretations differed.
I had one of the cadets talk to me while we were walking back from the first night's engagement, and he was a little thrown back of, how much he really had to justify his line of reasoning in answering questions.
When the students got together in the days that followed, and they started to explore the city together, that's when things got really interesting. Here's Ryan Smith, another student at RISD.
At one point he was talking about how he knew the solution to the problem. And I sort of stopped on the sidewalk and I said, well, you already know the solution to your problem? He's like, yeah, it's drones. And I said, the solution is drones. And then we talked about it. And then sort of over the course of the next hour, by the end of it, he said, the solution's probably not drones. And that wasn't because I was like, drones are stupid. We just had a conversation that eventually leads to this idea that maybe the first inclination isn't the correct inclination. In industrial design, our job is to, like in improv, you're supposed to say yes and And I feel like in design, you're supposed to say no, but you have to sort of refuse to acknowledge that somebody might be right, because if they're wrong, it's very bad, and if they're right, then they'll prove it to you. So just asking like, well, where do the drones take off from? How high do they go? How quiet can they be? How much can they lift? Like these sort of basic questions, and him going, well, I guess they wouldn't be able to lift as many MREs as they would need to, so it'd have to be a bigger drone. And then we would like Google a bigger drone, and it's, you watch a YouTube video and you have to take your headphones out because it's too loud, and you're like, well, that wouldn't really work at night then, be quieter. And you sort of find more interesting pathways.
Dave Kang had a similar experience with his group, which tried to plan how to resupply troops in a city without letting enemies know.
These kids are trying to like use like the craziest tech they can think of and like use like the most advanced technology, and I was like, maybe like tech isn't the best way to go.
At this point in his story, Dave stopped. We were sitting next to a window, and he looked out at the trees.
Have you seen those houses in the desert that are covered with mirrors? And whenever, if you look at them from like certain angles, like it looks kind of like camouflage with the background. Yeah. And I was thinking if like these packages were covered in those mirrors and like hid amongst like the trees, because how often do people take the time to like look up?
And in listening to these stories, this is about where I started to understand what design thinking actually is. Because I think I thought it was just about making things look good. The reality is that just looking at things from another perspective, from that of an industrial design student, for example, and asking a whole lot of questions, can completely change your plan. So, going back to those nuclear threats, there was this other presentation that was way, way, way outside the box. And I'll warn you now, it has something to do with eugenics.
What if you had enough money or the right research and you could actually put this protector around your genes and give yourself this shield? I mean, maybe it's not enough just to look at correcting your own genes. What if you could propagate this through your future generations? And so if we can put the CRISPR engine then to replicate this DSUP for our kids, then you could protect your entire bloodline with just the same injection.
That's Cole Jorison. He's tall with curly hair and glasses and a crazy whiz at making movies. His presentation actually opened with one. And long story short, he wants to use the ideas behind CRISPR gene drive, which could actually realistically be used to alter human genes, to make us all more resistant to radiation.
And so I hypothesized, what would it be like if you could put this in rice and then, maybe you could activate contaminated lands? What if you could put this in fish and you could have a radiation-resistant type of genetically modified fish product? And what if you could use this for humans and alter the human conditions so that we could be more resistant to radiation and maybe look at the effects of the nuclear industry from a kind of human-centered perspective?
And so what would the use of that be? If folks were more radiation resistant, the idea is that then...
Well, I'm not quite sure what would come of it, but I think there's an interesting provocation in the idea of looking at the nuclear harm as a kind of genetic biohazard. And so if we look at the threat of the nuclear industry, it's not isolated from bombs and killing people, but the real difference is that differentiates it from every single other threat is the fallout and the fact that the radioactive particles can change DNA and they can create mutations in a variety of different species. So we're at this point in biotechnology where we can actually begin to engineer species. And I'm curious as to how we can use this to maybe reframe wicked problems such as the nuclear threat.
The possibilities are endless, and they're not all good. But there is something else kind of interesting hidden in Cole's thinking. Is there a possibility that this could render nuclear weapons impotent? Because the real fear in nuclear weapons is the radiation and the after effects? Well,
I don't like to separate the fear of nuclear bombs as completely separate from like a military invasion. If we're manufacturing a product with an industry that it's putting out these byproducts along the way for these potential use case scenarios of a nuclear weapon, that's where I think it gets a little ridiculous. There's $1 trillion in spending for a bomb we hope we never want to use.
Yeah, the environmental effects of the production of nuclear weapons and just having them at all. Yeah. Still exists whether you use them or not.
The disaster, if we use it, isn't going to be the radiation, unfortunately. It's going to be the fact that 200,000 people died at once. But 25 years later, that radiation is still going to permeate that land. It could affect the future generations of the people who live in that area, or they might not even end up being affected. But we don't know if there's a mutation in a genetic material that's making its way to the next generation. And we really can't trace these effects either.
There is something really different and scary about nuclear weapons. Something that makes us launch wars to stop other countries from getting them. And at least one part of that something is the radiation. The other is that they are actually really, really big bombs. Thousands of times larger than the Moab, or the mother of all bombs the Trump administration dropped in Afghanistan. But what if humans were immune to the effects of radiation? Not because of genetic modification, but maybe because of a vaccine or some other means. Would it change our relationship with nuclear technology? And would it make the idea that nuclear weapons are now and will forever be a threat a little less concrete? Would it make the threat a little less existential? I don't know. The idea of getting rid of the biggest weapon in our arsenal might still seem like a moonshot. But if we were to chip away at the problem by isolating the issue to the impacts of radiation, suddenly we would be talking about a health problem, sort of like curing cancer. And that's a worthy effort. What if we'd just thrown in the towel when faced with the threat of polio, or malaria, or smallpox? And what if Amon's Girl Scouts, the next generation, grew up saying they were going to find a cure for radiation sickness? I'm not saying Cole's idea is the answer to all of our problems. There are a whole lot of terrible possible outcomes, too. But that's kind of the point. There are infinite possibilities in this world, and we know this. Many of our personal lives are littered with motivational reminders to push the limits and get outside of our comfort zone. But even then, it can be easy to fall back on what we know. And in national security, where pragmatism is valued above almost all else, it's even easier. So what if we stopped? What if we decided right now to assume that everything we know is wrong? To ask more questions and to search for more blue sky, even when we're dealing with the biggest, most intractable problems. Together, what could we achieve? Things That Go Boom is a podcast about the ins, outs, and what have yous of what keeps us safe from PRI and Inkstick Media. This episode was produced by Tracy Wall and written by me. Our music was composed by Darian Schulman, and Abdullah Rufus was our technical advisor. Thank you to N Square and Plowshares Fund for supporting this work. Next week, what happens to the men and women we send to war?